So, how does Paul's theology of handing over help us to understand sexual ethics, especially what Paul often highlights and what is often highlighted in Scripture, um, same sex sexual relations or homosexuality? Hi, my name is Dr. Jordan Cos, and this is Millennial Harbinger Channel. And we are finishing up with part two of going through a little bit of Beverly Roberts Gaventa's new Romans commentary in the Old Testament library, or New Testament library, that is, commentary series. And it's a really good commentary. And what I want to do is start off kind of a little bit summarizing a little bit of what we talked about in the first video, and then start reading the section, chapter 1, 24 through 32, where handed over is mentioned by Paul 3 times. Okay, so sin and death. She has this whole discussion on how she understands sin and death, and why she capitalizes it, both in the excursus and also in like chapter 8 we looked at in the part 1. But the sin and death discussion is related to the paradidomi, or the handing over discussion, that we're going to read in pages 63 through 72. Because both Jesus and humanity are said to be handed over to these evil agents that are implied when Paul uses this terminology of handed over, or of handing people over, handing Jesus over in chapter 8, handing humanity over in chapter 1. Okay? So what she says sin and death are, from both the excursus and in her discussion on chapter 8, verses 31 through 39, are this. Sin and death are the powers. They are, quote, subjects of active verbs. They are a suprahuman power. They are God's enemy. They are creatures. They are created. They are agents that work against God. They are anti-God. They are, and this is one of the significant comments she makes about sin and death, they are ontological metaphors, or she says, attempts to convey a reality that exists beyond the confines of language, attempts to give expression to the profound captivity of human beings. That includes all of creation. Okay? All right. They are what she calls the third party that the handing over term implies. You can't hand something over without a third party. Okay, so one person takes control, a first party takes control of a second party, and then hands that second party over to a third party. Okay? They are, she says, and I struggle pronouncing this grammatical term, metonymically referenced as impurity, dishonorable passions, and an unsuitable way of thinking, she says in chapter 1, 24 through 32. Okay? So they're metonyms, what we're going to come across in terms of what Paul says humanity is handed over to. She calls the way the third parties are mentioned, who we come to know as sin and death later in the letter, Paul uses the rhetorical device of metonyms. Okay. She also calls them the unnamed powers. Okay, the unnamed powers, and we're going to get into in her discussion on verses 24 to 32 in chapter 1 how she discusses them. And here's though a little bit of that before we dive in. She says the identified agents of God's handing over, rather than an abstraction, first explicitly named as sin in chapter 3, verse 9. So sin and death are the identified agent of God's handing over, and rather than an abstraction on page 65, and first explicitly named as sin in chapter 3, verse 9. And then she says it's a metonym, the metonym impurity, for sin recalls the unclean, impure spirits that subject human beings to possession who are closely associated with the powers of God's enemy, Satan, in the Gospels. And then metonyms anticipate the explicit introduction of the anti-God powers later in the letter. Okay, so Paul is going to make use of describing the third party in chapter 1. He's going to make use of metonyms, is what Gaventa says. Instead of explicitly naming who humanity is handed over to, she's going to be using metonyms, assuming, I think, Paul is, that his readers or listeners, because the letter was read to the church in Rome, it seems that Paul is going to assume that everybody knows what he's talking about when he doesn't explicitly name who humanity is handed over to. And that causes us some confusion because we're like, hey, wait, Paul, could you be a little bit more explicit? Well, he didn't need to be in the first century because everybody probably understood who he was talking about, but we don't. And it seems that Gaventa is a little reluctant. Again, observation from part 1 is that she's reluctant to name these evil agents beyond just sin and death. Is that like Paul? I don't think Paul is being reluctant to name them because Paul knows who they are, and he knew that his audience knew who they were as well. And this again is where Michael Heiser's Deuteronomy 32 worldview, or the Divine Council worldview, can help us, because again, Michael Heiser said at chapter 1, Romans 1, where all this handed over terminology is found, is like the best place to go to in the New Testament to see the Deuteronomy 32 worldview at play being expressed by Paul. And Paul's understanding of that playing out and how he understood humanity's condition, idolatry, worshiping rebel spiritual beings that leads to human wickedness, God's handing over of humanity to these supernatural powers, leading to further human wickedness, right? And so, okay, Heiser's Deuteronomy 32 worldview could help us. It could help. I think it could have helped her kind of say a little bit more about them in the commentary, but again, she does not utilize, it seems, those works at all. And number 2, how can she have this understanding of paradidomi? And this is a question that popped in my mind as well. How can she have this understanding of paradidomi, or handing over, as they're being handed over to the powers, handed over to sin and death, which represent supernatural evil? How can she have this understanding and also be affirming? I don't know. But we're going to try to find out a little bit more as we read through the section, verses 24 through 32 in chapter 1, perhaps how she has this understanding of paradidomi, but is also affirming. Because I don't think you can be affirming and truly understand what Romans 1, 24 through 32, or Romans 1, 18 through 2:11. I don't think you can truly be affirming once you understand Romans 1, 18 through 2:11, in light of how Paul understands it, in light of how Paul expressed himself using this terminology and the Old Testament background to his thoughts. I don't think you can be affirming, especially after you Heiser's Deuteronomy 32 worldview helps you understand Paul's words in this section of Romans 1 and 2. It took me a while to get that out, but there it is. But let's jump in to Gaventa's commentary and see what we can find. So we're going to start on page, 63. And here is the section is highlighted as, okay, the 24 through 32, verses 24 to 32 section of discussion is beginning. And in that first paragraph, she says, with the opening of verse 24, God again is the agent, as at the end of verse 19, and here God's action takes a form that is genuinely terrifying, for Paul declares that God handed them over. Okay? This declaration shifts the terms of the story, for there is now a new character to whom God is handing over an ingrate, worshipless humanity, a character as yet unnamed, who will produce in humanity not simply more idolatry, but a massive harvest of misconduct that requires the remainder of the chapter to enumerate. And the distinctiveness of this assertion is more impressive when compared with the often adduced Wisdom 13 through 15, which does not attribute to God a direct role in the handing over of sinners. And she says the same is true also of other texts customarily cited in connection with Romans 1:18 through 32. And she lists a bunch of extra biblical sources right there, including the Testament of Naphtali, Josephus, Philo, Sibylline Oracles, Letter of Aristeas. Okay. Next paragraph. And this is really cool. So check this out. The repetition of the phrase God handed them over in verse 26 and again in verse 28 marks it as crucial to the passage, perhaps even to the whole letter. Comparison to Paul's use of repetition near the beginning of earlier letters is instructive. In the opening lines of Galatians, Paul twice pronounces a curse on those who would preach another gospel. And 2 Corinthians 1, 3 through 7 repeats paraklesis, exhortation, and the related verb parakaleo, exhort. In both contexts, the repetitions signal a major concern of the letter. Syntactically, Romans 1, 24, 26, and 28 are closer to 1 Corinthians 1, 27 to 28, in that there also, Paul repeats a verb 3 times, in each case with God as the subject. Translated rather woodenly, the foolish things of the world God chose, the weak things of the world God chose, the low-born things of the world, and the despised God chose. As with the examples from Galatians and 2 Corinthians, here Paul announces a key issue of the letter. In this case, the authority of God over human ways of knowing and assessing. Such passages strengthen the supposition that the repetition of 1, 24, 26, and 28 similarly signals a major concern of the letter. The 3 paradokin God handed over clauses in verses 24, 26, and 28 introduce 3 subsections of this final movement in the passage. Verses 24 to 25, verses 26 to 27, verses 28 to 32. And here is her translation. Therefore God handed them over because of the desires of their hearts to impurity. Verse 26, therefore God handed them over to dishonorable desires. Verse 28, and because God handed them over to an unfit way of thinking. All right. Earlier commentators understood these paradokin statements in a permissive or privative sense, according to which God withdraws, permitting humanity to go its own way. And she cites Chrysostom, Augustine. And more recent commentators have treated them forensically with the understanding that God hands humanity over to judgment. Okay? But, next paragraph. More needs to be said of this handing over. And I really appreciate Gaventa being, again, somebody who really dives into what in the world Paul is getting at with this terminology of handing over. More needs to be said of this handing over, both as it involves God and as it suggests the involvement of a third party. Xenophon writes that Cyrus intimidated the Syrians to surrender, paradidomi, a fort. Pausanias recounts Antioch's surrender, paradidomi, of a stronghold to Heracles. In the Septuagint, the verb paradidomi regularly refers to the turning over of someone or something to a third party, often in a situation of conflict. For example, in Deuteronomy 2:24, Moses recounts God's words, look, I have handed over to your hand King Sihon. All right, that's significant. The prophets routinely use paradidomi when declaring God's intention to hand Israel itself over, as when Jeremiah 21:10 announces that Jerusalem will be handed over to Babylon. Ezekiel warns that God will turn over Israel's possessions to the wicked of the earth. Paul himself uses the verb similarly in 1 Corinthians 5:5, 15:24, Romans 4:25, 6:17, 8:32. See also 1 Corinthians 11:23 and Galatians 2:20. All right. Additionally, in most instances of handing over, the third party is an identifiable agent rather than an abstraction. Okay. That's where I got one of those comments I mentioned earlier, if that makes more sense now reading it within context. Even in prophetic texts warning about the outcome of unfaithful or disobedient behavior, the handing over involves another power, i.e., the Chaldeans, the hands of the foreigners, the will of your enemies, or the people of the East, rather than an abstraction depicting the consequences of wrongdoing. Okay, that's an important observation. This widespread pattern of usage suggests that in Romans 1, 24, 26, and 28, also the handing over takes place in a situation of conflict that involves God, humanity, and the third party. The third party has not yet been identified, but it will be explicitly named as sin in chapter 3, verse 9. All are under the power of, and she capitalizes, sin. Paul does not point in direction of the third party even here, however, since all three instances of the paradidomi phrase in Romans 1 are followed by eis, to or into, and an object and identifying the power to which humanity has been delivered up. The first paradidomi clause, unlike the second and third, is followed immediately by because of the desires of their hearts. Although Paul can write of desire in a positive sense as conveying his longing to be with Christ, Philippians 1:23, or his longing to be reunited with the Thessalonians, 1 Thessalonians 2:17, desire often has a connotation of forbidden desire or desire that is out of control. Romans 13:14, 1 Thessalonians 4:5, Galatians 5:16-24. In this particular context, the desires of their heart stands as an apt summary of verses 21 to 23. What humanity has desired is released from the obligation to acknowledge God, resulting in the senseless heart of verse 21. Because of these various desires, God handed them over. With the remainder of the verse, God handed them over to impurity so that their very bodies were dishonored. Paul gives the first indication of the captor to whom humanity has been delivered. The language of, quote, impurity, akatharsia, or its cognate, the adjective akathartos, if I'm pronouncing that right, seldom appears in Paul's letters. 1 Corinthians 7:14, 2 Corinthians 6:17, 12:21, Galatians 5:19, 1 Thessalonians 2:3, 4:7. But in Romans it appears again in 6:19 as Paul recalls that the audience earlier had presented your limbs as slaves to impurity. The following verse picks up the same point, this time with the wording, when you were slaves of sin. Impurity in 6:19 metonymically represents sin itself. And the same conclusion may be appropriate for 124. Gospel usage confirms this perception since, and I think this is a significant comment, the unclean or impure spirits that subject human beings to possession are there closely associated with the powers of God's enemy, Satan. Mark 3:11, Luke 4:33, 36. All right, I think that was a cool observation. The result of this captivity by impurity is the dishonoring of human bodies. In view of the association of impurity and sexual immorality elsewhere in Paul's letters, 2 Corinthians 12:21, Galatians 5:19, 1 Thessalonians 4:7, and in the lines that follow, the dishonoring of the body refers to the physical body that is inappropriate and shameful sexual conduct. More is included here, however, than sexuality. The soma body is the entire person, the capacity for communication. The whole person is dishonored, which means that dishonoring involves not just the sexual human, but the intellectual one, the emotional one, the commercial one, and so on. Hence the long list of vices in verses 28 to 31. It is this total dishonoring Paul has in mind, as is clear when he returns to the topic of idolatry in verse 25. In addition, this dishonoring is reversed when the rescued humanity is enabled to deliver up the entire body as a sacrifice in chapter 12, verse 1. Interesting. Okay. So I'm going to skip ahead here, but I want to read this one footnote she has, footnote 27. And she highlights a comment by both Karl Barth and Ambrosiaster. Ambrosiaster seems to draw the same conclusion when he writes of this passage, they, in turning away from God, were given up to the devil. And see the perceptive comments on paradidomi here and elsewhere in the New Testament in Barth's work. God, quote, God makes humans so powerless that he gives them over to the authority of a power which is too great for them. The power, in fact, of their enemy. that he may rule them. Okay, so and both Ambrosiaster and Karl Barth recognize the handing over terminology and what it's actually referencing, even though it's not explicit, but perhaps explicit for the original readers and for Paul. Okay, skipping a couple paragraphs. Verse 26 replays the initial paradokan clause of verse 24. See above for discussion. But now the object of handing over is dishonorable passions. Eis pathe atimias, if I'm pronouncing the Greek correctly. With the same phrase, 1 Thessalonians 4:5 warns believers that the sexual immorality of those outside the community, but otherwise Paul does not use the word pathos. The closely related expression sinful desires does appear in Romans 7:5, where these sinful desires are said to work through the law to bring about death. Sinful desires, then, are capable of being the subject of action capable of ensnaring human beings. As with impurity, verse 24, dishonorable passions anticipates the explicit introduction of the anti-God powers later in the letter. It's another metonym. Okay, the remainder of verses 26 and 27 offers specific examples of the working of these sinful passions in the form of homoerotic behavior. Here we go. All right. Many features of these verses and the concerns that give rise to them warrant attention, but understanding their place in the argument is crucial. Paul has already identified human ungodliness and wrong with the refusal to give God thanks and praise, as a result of which God surrendered humanity over to God's own enemies, here identified as impurity, dishonorable passions, and an unfit mind. The behavior of verses 26 and 27, as well as the actions that follow in verses 28 to 31, stand as illustrations of the consequences of capital sin, not as capital sin in and of itself. The behavior, and I think that's a significant comment right there, they stand as illustrations of the consequences of being captives of sin, not as sin in and of itself. Okay? The behavior adduced as the first example of the control of the dishonorable passions is that of same-sex relations. In the context of an accusation about idolatry, the introduction of what Paul regards as sexual immorality is scarcely surprising, since the two are regularly linked in Jewish tradition. Isaiah 57, Jeremiah 8, Ezekiel 16 and 18, Hosea 2, Micah 1, Wisdom 14. See also Acts 15 and chapter 21. Given the rhetorical force of this passage, pulling hearers in so that they stand alongside Paul and Phoebe in indignation at their behavior, the decision to comment specifically on same-sex relations is a shrewd one, as it plays on this widespread revulsion at homoerotic behavior in Paul's social world. That's an interesting choice of words. Same-sex relations are rarely, interesting choice of words again. Same-sex relations are rarely mentioned in biblical texts, but they are routinely condemned when mentioned. Leviticus 18, and 20, 1 Corinthians 6, 1 Timothy 1. Okay, and here, right after that line, she has a footnote, and here's what she says in this footnote. Others have posited a link between this passage in Genesis 1 and 2, arguing that the references to God as creator suggest that he and his audience would recollect the Genesis account. And she references Hayes in his work in 1996. But again, our mind shouldn't go to Genesis 1 and 2. It should go to the Deuteronomy 32 worldview that Heiser mentions. He didn't dive into that and unpack that at all. But in my paper that I wrote to try to do that, I think helps us begin to see that. And again, I wasn't comprehensive, but those first 7-8 episodes on this channel perhaps can help you start to see that as well. She goes on with this footnote comment. Of course, interest in God as creator is in no way confined to Genesis. All right, and she mentions a bunch of verses, making it precarious to assume that Genesis 1 and 2 are in play here, simply by virtue of creation language. Correct. Yeah. More importantly, those texts demonstrate the divine origin of procreation in marriages. They do not restrict marriage to male-female couples capable of procreation or prescribe heterosexual marriage for everyone. And she references fret time and furnish. Okay. There's her affirming language there, and affirming statement. Okay. That last line, more importantly, those texts demonstrate the divine origin of procreation and marriage. They do not restrict marriage to male-female couples capable of procreation or prescribe heterosexual marriage for everyone. So she, like Fred Time and Furnish, apparently, are commenting about Romans 1, she particularly, with the assumption that Genesis 1 and 2 aren't teaching that marriage is restricted to male-female couples, or prescribing heterosexual marriage. So, yeah, I mean, if you're going to have that assumption of Genesis 1 and 2, that's going to affect how you write your commentary on Romans 1 here. And so, again, the question posed is, how did she get there in Romans 1, though, without that understanding of Genesis 1 and 2 affecting her reading and interpretation of Romans 1? Like, so is her interpretation of Romans 1 affirming just because of her understanding of Genesis 1 and 2? Or is the egg before the chicken before the egg? Like, again, help me out here. Let's see if she helps us understand. Going back up to the paragraph we left off at. Paul's comments do not merely replay the strictures of Leviticus, however, they also reflect the Roman world's understanding of gender hierarchy. In non-Jewish texts, sexual relations between people of the same gender were understood to be abnormal, not because of divine disapproval, but because masculinity was associated with the act of penetration. Real men were those who penetrated, and men who were sexually passive, acted upon rather than acting, were regarded with disdain. Okay, and she references multiple sources there. In the context of a larger indictment of the charges of refusing to serve God as God, refusing to conform to the order of creation, this ancient understanding of homoeroticism as a violation of the natural order serves Paul's argument particularly well. So there, she kind of reiterates a common affirming argument again. It's like, it's not that New Testament writers were against it. It's that, this was just a social cultural means argument. So I just see what Gaventa is writing here as reiterating what, like, maybe some other scholars like Richard Hayes and Christopher Hayes would say. Other scholars like Karen Keene would say, and other affirming. This is like a common retort to Romans 1 is that what we just read in the rest of that paragraph, where it's basically like, it's not that Paul himself thought that this was a sin. He's just taking advantage of a common cultural thought of the day. And again, this reading of Romans 1 is colored by an affirming take on Genesis 1 and 2. Okay, so I'm going to move on. And because, again, my question is, maybe she showed us a little bit of her cards there in terms of how she's interpreting Romans 1, but still, how can you interpret Romans 1, understand paradidomi being handed over, this terminology, and knowing in general what that's referencing, and still be affirming? I'm still kind of fuzzy on that, right? Okay, well, let's move on. Paul begins with reference to the behavior of women, striking decision since most ancient texts that refer to homoeroticism make no reference to women. And the conventional pattern would be to speak about men first, women only secondarily, if at all. Instead of the more usual noun for women, gene, Paul uses thalos, which appears in context having to do with created sexual differences, Genesis 1:27, Septuagint, Galatians 3:28. Paul writes that their females exchange the natural sexual practice for the one that is unnatural, repeating the chains exchange language earlier in the passage. Sexual behavior is not explicitly mentioned, but krisis has the connotation of sexual use, and the explicit language of verse 27 leaves no doubt that Paul refers to sexual use here. Okay. Precisely because Paul does not unambiguously say that women engaged in sexual relations with one another, it has been argued that what he has in mind here is not same-sex relations at all, but impermissible heterosexual behavior. The likewise at the beginning of verse 27, however, firmly connects the two statements with one another. So she recognizes, yeah, it's talking about lesbian sexual activity here. Interesting. Okay. In addition, since verse 27 clearly refers to homoerotic sexual relations, it is highly likely that verse 26 does also. Paul's indirectness in verse 26 may derive from a certain discomfort with any discussion of female sexual behavior. Okay. Next paragraph discusses this paraphysin phrase that has often been zeroed in on in the affirming, non-affirming argumentation and debate. Here she says the phrase paraphysin, here translated unnatural, i.e. contrary to nature, has evoked considerable discussion because the preposition para can have the connotation of beyond as well as contrary. Some have argued that here it should be taken as beyond nature, that is, behaviors outside of one's natural proclivity, so that persons of heterosexual orientation would be acting beyond their nature if they engaged in homosexual acts. Boswell, Hayes. As has been well established, however, the ancient world did not operate with an understanding of heterosexual or homosexual orientation, so that this proposal transposes a distinctly modern concept into an alien framework. But this is what affirming scholars kind of also do. They transpose the distinctly modern concepts and thinking into ancient writings. Okay? She goes on. In addition, while the preposition para can imply more than or beyond, as in they worshipped and served the created instead of para, the creator, or more highly than you ought to think, 12:3, the phrase paraphysin regularly occurs in texts concerning sexual conduct, where it is contrasted with cataphysin, in conformity to nature. She references Josephus, Philo, Plutarch. Okay? All right. But again, that last paragraph, you see hints of that affirming perspective. Okay? And here in this next paragraph, I think we see some more. What one society construes as natural, however, another may regard as unnatural. For example, Paul regards nature as requiring that men have short hair and women long hair. 1 Corinthians 11. Oh man. A conviction that seems quaint to contemporary readers. Parentheses, and see as reference to Gentiles who do not have the law by nature in Romans 2:14. In parentheses. And especially in the arena of sexual conduct, understandings of what is or is not regarded as natural have a great deal to do with assumptions about the social order. Again, affirming terminology argumentation. For Roman society, as noted above, the sexual hierarchy reflected the assumption of the superiority of the active penetrator over the passive penetrated. The notion of women engaged in sexual relations with one another then was contrary to nature, since women were regarded as naturally passive and their sexual relations were thought to reflect that passivity. But 1 Corinthians, ironically, 11, as Dr. Heiser has also talked about on his podcast, the Naked Bible podcast, he has a whole episode on this where he goes through another scholar's article where it helps us see that Paul's verbiage and argument in 1 Corinthians 11 is based upon the same background and understanding of these rebel spiritual beings that we know of from Genesis 6. So it's like, don't do this certain thing because of the angels, right? And there's the long hair, short hair thing. The hair was thought to be a sexual organ. So for women wanted it to be longer so that they could suck up the semen into their bodies and get pregnant. So men shouldn't have long hair because you don't want to be feminine, right? So you need to go listen to that podcast episode on the Naked Bible podcast. Really, really, and you also need to read that article. I can't remember who was the author of it or the title of it, but Paul's argumentation in 1 Corinthians 11 the background of that, his foundation of that, is the same foundation we see here in Romans 1 that Gaventa doesn't see. It's the Deuteronomy 32 worldview. It's the supernatural understanding of Genesis 6. Okay, let's move forward. Okay, verse 26 is relatively indirect in its comments on sex between women, but the condemnation of same-sex relations among men is scarcely to be accused of similar indirectness. Here, Paul does not only states the matter explicitly, men with men, but describes it as burning with strong desire, as shameful behavior, and as deserving of its reward. The striking image of burning desire provides a clue to Paul's concern. And see the similar notion in 1 Corinthians 7:9. In common with his contemporaries, he regarded desire of any kind as dangerous, sexual desire is especially dangerous, and same-sex relations as evidence of desire out of control. Okay? And here she has a footnote at the end of that line. It says, see, for example, Philo, Dio, Chrysostom, and Martin. And Martin comments, gluttony was too much eating. Homosexuality was too much sex. Okay. Homoerotic conduct serves Paul's argument especially well then, because according to assumptions prevalent at the time, it epitomizes the cancerous passions that result from God handing over humankind to its own desires. Again, the verbiage there is affirming, the argumentation there. You can sense the affirmingness. Assumptions prevalent at the time. All right. Paul isn't making his argument based on assumptions prevalent at the time. He's making his argument based upon that Deuteronomy 32 review and as the underbelly from which to understand sexual ethics. And but it just so happens that perhaps also the sexual mores of that time also fit in to that underbelly that remains the same in the Old Testament and New Testament and our current Christian age. Okay. Next paragraph. When introducing the third and final paradidomi clause in verse 28, Paul extends the brief introductions of verse 24 and 26 to the statement, and because they did not suitably acknowledge God. This statement reinforces the earlier charge that humanity has refused to acknowledge God as God, that the underlying problem is one of false worship and ingratitude. The behaviors introduced, whether sexual or otherwise, result from this fundamental refusal to acknowledge God. In this third instance, God hands humanity over to an unfit way of thinking. Unsuitable arakimos here plays on the phrase, did not suitably acknowledge. That opens the verse. Although this third phrase, an unsuitable way of thinking, does not appear again in Romans, a closely related expression appears in chapter 8, verse 6 and 7, referring to the thinking of the flesh that is death. A way of thinking that sets itself over against God. As in the first two paradidomi clauses of verses 24 and 26, this is yet another instance of metonymy. Metonymy? Yeah, I think I'm getting it right now. What God hands humanity over to is capital sin, the third party. Here expressed as an unfit mind, with the result that they did things that are not to be done. Okay, with verses 29 through 31, Paul enumerates other results of this handing over in the form of a list of vices, similar to other such lists found elsewhere in the New Testament and in other literature of the period. This one is notable in that it is the only such list in the Pauline letters that makes no reference to sexual immorality, presumably because 26 and 27 have already done so. When read in translation, the list seems to conform to no order whatever, but it does in fact reflect careful construction. And this is a cool observation that she makes here. Verse 29 consists of two parallel adjectival constructions, beginning with being filled up or full of. The first is followed by four nouns: evil, wrong, wickedness, greed. And the second by four nouns: envy, murder, discord, and malicious cunning. Verses 30 to 31 itemize 12 vices. The final four of which, verse 31, are all alpha privatives, combining the alliteration of the A alpha sound with the accusation against humankind. Far from random, the presentation is highly organized and rhetorically dramatic. A number of the items included appear in other such lists, but the opening is particularly appropriate to the letter. It begins with being filled up with all wrong. There's that phrase, adikia again. Recalling the all motif earlier in the chapter, equally important, wrong underscores both the opening announcement of God's wrath against all wrong and the rectification of that wrong announced in 1:16 through 17. Okay. The summation of verse 32 draws the list to a close. Although humans know the ordinance of God that those who do such things deserve death, they not only do them, but approve of those who do them. It is hard to understand how approving those who do wrong ranks alongside or even ahead of actually doing the wrong. 2 Corinthians 8:10, however, may offer a parallel move. That there Paul recalls how the Corinthians began not only to act in the matter of the collection, but also to the will that act. By prioritizing the approval of bad actions, Paul may be anticipating the turn in 2:1 to the accusation about judging others. And that's also sticky in terms of like, okay, so if we read Romans 1 the way early Jews and early Christians did for the majority of history, Judeo-Christian sexual ethics, then it's very dangerous then to approve of same-sex sexual relations, of homosexuality. If what Paul's saying here, and Gaventa is expressing is accurate, like if we approve or affirm that behavior, those who approve of it are also in trouble. That's sobering. Next paragraph, the declaration that people who do these things deserve death seems extreme, particularly when the list includes offenses such as gossip and bragging. This hyperbolic claim confirms the observation that Paul is not so much drawing up a bill of particulars, making a case against each and every individual based on observed actions, correct, I would say, as he is in analyzing the results of human rejection of God. What precisely does it mean to say that they are worthy of death? Customarily, this assertion is read as deserve to die, to be deserving of the end of life. When the word death re-enters the letter in chapter 5, however, it does so as a power by the name of capital death that enters the world to take humanity captive. It is not at all unlikely that this notion of captivity to the powers is at work in chapter 1 as well. I would say she's right. She just doesn't go far enough in identifying them the way Heiser and those with a DCW understanding, I think, can, have, and do, and will. The sweeping character of the accusation and the rhetoric in this passage prompts some readers and hearers to react with incredulity. It is simply wrong to say that all, even all Gentiles, have committed the actions so confidently recited here. Indeed, in a few short lines, Paul himself will praise some Gentiles for their unwitting keeping of the law. After all, even the Areopagus speech of Acts 17, which places on Paul's lips another attack on idolatry, credits those same idolaters with a desire for God, albeit a falsely directed search. Sure. Wow. Yet complaining that Paul is guilty of hyperbole misses the nature of the accusation. Yes, I would say so. Good. Get going. This is not a legal argument in which Paul presents a bill of particulars and documents the offenses of every single human being. It more closely resembles an observation that the voting public has no concern for the long-term flourishing of the economy, or that car buyers pay too little attention to gas mileage. Like such statements, Paul's analysis takes place on a large canvas. Although the audiences gathered in Rome may relish momentarily the thought that they, Paul and Dice, are other people, by the time Phoebe reaches 3:9 in her reading of the letter, it is clear that this canvas involves all of humankind. And I think you can get there even in before this. That what Paul is saying here is indicting both all of humanity, Gentiles and Israel, both all of humanity and Jewish Christians, both all of humanity and Gentile Christians. But it is clear that this canvas involves all of humankind. Indeed, the story is even larger than all of humanity, since it involves not only God, but also the captors of humankind, sin and death. Again, capitalized. The letter shows plainly that the wrath of God stems from human rejection of God, and that humanity is handed over to sin, capital, as a consequence, which in turn produces captivity to the various behaviors depicted, because they're captive to these supernatural powers that leads to human wickedness. And the behaviors mentioned by Paul, with Paul highlighting, again, homosexual behavior, same-sex sexual relations. If some, and this is her final paragraph of her discussion on verses 24 through 32. So here we go. We're wrapping up. We're at 45 minutes, almost done. If some contemporary readers recoil at the ferocity of Paul's argument, others will be profoundly angered by his decision to use same-sex relations as a primary illustration of the workings of sin. Yeah. Yeah, he does that. Far too many readers may resemble the small gatherings of believers who listen to Phoebe read this passage for the first time, happily identifying themselves as the unspoken we and urging Paul on in his accusation against them, those Gentiles who deserve death. And I hope she's not hinting at like traditional non-affirming Christians, because there's this like too much of a stereotype that Christians, those non-affirming Christians, are mean and mistreat those who are homosexual, those who are LGBTQ plus. But they may anticipate that this accusation serves as a prelude to a word of comfort for God's faithful people, both Jews and the Gentiles who have joined them. Okay. Wisdom of Solomon, after all, moves from its castigation of the Gentiles to assuring its audience that Israel will not sin. 15:1-6. Phoebe's hearers are about to receive a rude awakening if they imagine that somehow they are exempt from the accusation of this drama. Okay, so a little bit more kind of affirming verbiage in mentioning how, some people might be angered by the decision to use same-sex relations as a primary illustration of the workings of sin. But that's what the New Testament does. That's what Paul does. That's what Paul's Bible does, the Hebrew Bible, the Septuagint. It uses that because, again, as I think what Paul has in his mind foundationally is that same-sex sexual relations are parallel to what the watchers did in Genesis 6, and how humanity's and the men of Sodom and Gomorrah in chapter 19 of Genesis, how their actions paralleled the watchers' actions by breaking creational boundaries, by doing what they did, that sexual sin. I think that's at play in that theological underbelly that I think rides all the way from obviously Genesis 1 through Revelation 22 and beyond, and is the same today. But that's Gaventa's discussion. I don't think she gives us in her reasoning in this part why she understands the third party, sin and death, the way they do, the handing over, referring to them, to supernatural evil, how she understands and interprets it that way, which I think is true and accurate, as Heiser's comment about Romans 1 helped me see a couple years ago. I don't know how she's there on paradidomi, but also is affirming. I don't think she made that connection, because like in my mind right now, I don't think you can make that connection, be both understand paradidomi like that, but also be affirming in your reading of Romans 1. I don't think you could do that, make that connection here. And I don't think she showed us how she did make that connection. So I don't know. I mean, she mentioned how she reads Genesis 1 and 2, and she mentioned some common trendy affirming arguments for how to understand what Paul's saying here in Romans 1 in terms of culture at that time. But again, I'm kind of disappointed in her discussion of verses 24 to 32 because I guess she doesn't really show me. I mean, I could be wrong. You tell me. You can make comments on this video. She didn't show me how she got from A to B. So I'm still trying to. One thing I'm trying to do, I'm trying to understand affirming scholars and those who are affirming, how they get there. And again, when we went over the Hayes and Hayes recent book, The Widening of God's Mercy, they didn't bother showing us how they got from They're there um, in those very passages. Um, they just kind of said, "Hey, God changed his mind," but I'm trying to understand that perspective. I'm still non-affirming myself. I don't imagine myself becoming affirming, but I'm trying to understand the affirming argument. That's why I'm reading this. That's why I'm reading Hayes and Hayes. That's why I'm reading Sally Gary and Karen Keene's books, and um, trying to keep up with the literature. And I'm not doing a very good job at that as a teacher who's got to grade and do other things. But I'm trying to do that. I'm trying to understand the affirming argument. But that's what I got for you today. Gaventa's commentary. It's good. I like it. I don't agree with her affirming stance, but that's what she says. She really helps us understand paradidomi, or handing over, better than perhaps most people where they're at with their understanding of that, which I think for most people who aren't obviously biblically trained, maybe they're not even seeing that in Romans 1. I know that didn't even come on my radar, appear on my radar, even in undergrad and graduate school, not until I was in doctoral studies. So that's it for this one. I hope to come back with an article that I discussed a couple episodes ago from another scholar. I can't think of his name right now. But thank you for watching. If you like this content, I'm going to be your typical YouTuber and just, hey, click a like and follow and share this video with others. Because, I'm just trying to help people figure things out here in terms of sexual ethics and LGBTQ plus, particularly homosexuality, which is such a big topic and debate today, and has been such a huge topic and subject and reality in my own life in a particular way that I won't go into. But it has so much in my own life, which has led me to talk about it and think about it and share my thoughts with you. But thank you for watching. We'll see you next time.